Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Jimmy Nguyen. I will be your host here today. It's the first episode of 2024, and I hope I'm not a broken record when I continue to express my thanks to our listeners and our community. It's been so cool, actually, over the past couple of weeks. I've just been noticing more people reaching out to me specifically saying, hey, I liked when you talked about that thing on that episode, or, when Nick interviewed that person, or, hey, that was a really relevant, conversation. Or the best is when folks are like, here's a piece of feedback, or I wish you all, would talk about this. And it just makes me feel like I'm actually connecting with our audience in these episodes. And I hope that we continue to provide just valuable and meaningful dialogue. I suspect that if you are a listener to this podcast, that probably means that you are interested in psychedelics for some type of an intentional reason, which probably means that you're likely going through something in your life. And so I just want to extend a lot of compassion and care to our listeners, and just know that somebody out there cares about your process and what you're going through, and whether that's with psychedelics, whether that's, through Psychedelic Passage services, kind of secondary. I just want folks to know that what you're going through matters, and that there are people who care. And so I hope that you're going out there and seeking the support and service that is right for you. I think today's episode is going to be pretty interesting. When we started out with this podcast over a year ago, one of our goals was to provide real, honest, tangible conversation to folks preparing for meaningful psychedelic experiences. And so we're going to get back to those roots a little bit today. And today's theme is discussing safety as a core foundation of psychedelic work. Now, when you hear that initially, I'm sure that maybe it comes off as like a duh or of course type thing. Like, of course, safety is important, in any experience where you're altering your consciousness, or venturing into something new, or doing self-reflection or deep work. But I actually think that there's a lot of nuances of safety that can be discussed in a way that can illuminate a lot of the different factors that should be considered when moving through a psychedelic experience. Primarily just the unknown mystery aspect of psychedelics in general. I mean, whether you're having your first experience, or whether you're on your 100th, 200th, 300th psychedelic experience, I don't think anybody can claim to know how a psychedelic experience is going to go. And I think that's a part of the way that psychedelics work, of course, but also just knowing that these substances and medicines are what are called non-specific amplifiers. That just means by nature that there can be a lot of unexpected things that come up, usually just content and memories and thought dialogue and things like that. And it's this interesting question of like, how do we instill a sense of safety while we're going through that? I think about almost this analogy of like extreme sports, like skydiving, for example. There's a lot of safety protocols in there that will hopefully keep you intact when you jump out of a plane and land on the ground. But if you were a first-time skydiver and you weren't familiar with the equipment, you weren't familiar with the protocols, you weren't familiar with, all of the information of how things go, all of those safety procedures can be in place, but you yourself might be in a state of unsafety, a state of fear, a state of unrest, if you will, maybe heightened anxiety. And yet you trust in the systems, you trust in the process in place. And maybe for folks who want to skydive, they're seeking adrenaline, or they're seeking to address their fear, or they're seeking a lot of reasons other than the normal Miller variety of, I guess, why people would jump out of a plane. The other interesting thing is that you always go with somebody your first time skydiving. And so I weave this analogy in just to kind of frame up this paradigm that, I think there are different like realms of talking about safety. And this episode, I hope, will break that down, talk through a couple of frameworks and concepts that have been helpful with at least, my client base, and then maybe even get a little bit more tangible on what you can do and what makes sense for you in your process. Ultimately, I think that safety really encompasses a lot of different arenas, as I've mentioned. And this topic has actually come up a lot in my own personal journey in psychedelic work, and also just with, my client work more recently. And whether it's on one extreme where an individual has never felt safe in their life or never felt safe in their body, or whether it was a event in their life or something traumatic, or even if it's on the other side of the extreme where a person generally has a solid sense of safety, but something in the psychedelic experience or whatever causes them to feel unsafe. And I'm also reminded of our episodes about, very early on in this podcast about, how to mitigate, what are termed as like bad trips. And I think there's a lot of nuance in that conversation, and not to oversimplify, but a lot of when folks are navigating challenging or difficult experiences, by nature, it can elicit a sense of unsafety within them, whether they feel like, oh my goodness, I'm going to be altered in the state forever, or wow, I'm really navigating through like deep emotion, pain, grief, trauma, or whether it's, oh man, I took too high of a dose. Now I have this fear of, really like losing it mentally. Those are often themes that accompany challenging or difficult experiences. And so, how do we return back to a grounded sense of safety in the midst of a lot of that challenging stuff, going on? And furthermore, how do we weave that into the processes before and after the psychedelic experience? One thing that I think our listeners have heard me say on past episodes is that there is so much emphasis on the dosing session or ceremony or medicine day. And obviously that's extremely important and kind of like the show, if you will, why folks engage in psychedelics. But I often think that so much emphasis on that can create a lot of, riding expectation on that. And furthermore, it can almost overlook the power and importance of preparation and integration. I probably said different percentages in the past, but when I look at like a whole pie chart of the preparation, ceremony, and integration process, I would say prep 40%, ceremony 20%, integration 40%. I think that's going to vary and differ, per person, but I'm just emphasizing how important prep and integration is. So before we get into all of the different aspects of safety across a couple of different realms, I want to talk a little bit about this concept that has recently come into my awareness, and I find it actually so helpful in the application of like preparing for a meaningful psychedelic experience. Now, there's this concept of like the window of tolerance that was, I think, first introduced by this doctor, Dr. Dan Siegel. And I've seen this applied emotionally. I've seen this applied in frameworks of like physical safety. But essentially, what it describes is that there is this window of tolerance of stress and trauma in which this is the ideal place in which you're coping with things. If you are on the upper limit of your window of tolerance, this generally, or if you go beyond the threshold of your upper limit of window of tolerance, that's probably the better way to say it, you can then go into what's like a hyper arousal state. So when you're thinking about like fight or flight or freeze or fawn, this is more of that fight, thing, or hypervigilance or anxiousness or overwhelm. This is when your nervous system is like overloaded and you are responding from that like heightened elicited, state. When let's say the bottom threshold of this window of tolerance, if you go beyond that, that can get you into what they call hypoarousal. So these would be things like spacey, zoned out, feeling numb, feeling somewhat disassociated, that more freeze type of response. And also not really a place that is the most ideal for you to navigate trauma, stress, unknown mystery, things that come up in psychedelic experiences. So you can start to see how this framework does apply to navigating psychedelic experiences, quite well. And the other thing to mention is that everybody's window of tolerance is different. What a lot of folks suggest is that folks who have been through trauma or have a specific mental health, symptom or condition that they're navigating through typically have a smaller window of tolerance. So when that window of tolerance shrinks, it doesn't give you a lot of room. There's a lot more that can like throw you off balance. This is actually pretty interesting because I've never framed it up this way, but I always chat with my clients about like, how do I return to like what I call like my center post in a psychedelic experience? Now, mind you, like a lot of this can be applied to life in general, but I'm talking specifically about, okay, how does this apply to navigating a psychedelic experience? And I think that's kind of the magic because the things that you're using in prep and the things that you're using to navigate a psychedelic experience and the things that you're using in integration are actually all tools that you can use to navigate your life in a way that's healthy and meaningful for you. So I just always love psychedelics just have this like parallel effect. To me, it's like a microcosm of like the life experience. I share like, aren't we all just kind of living a psychedelic life experience to one degree or another? So when I talk to clients, I'm like, okay, how do we work on like, you can maybe go down a specific, thought or visualized path or something in your psychedelic experience. And you can be deeply dropped into that experience, whether it's an ecstatic experience, a traumatic experience, a experience of memory, and then how do you return back to center? How do you return back to that grounded state of like observing, but also reminding yourself like, okay, I'm safe in my body. I'm safe in my mind. I have support here, all of that. And that's actually like harder to do in the moment, especially if you have a history of not feeling safe, in your life and leading up to that. And so I really do love this window of tolerance, concept because I think that working with a facilitator or a service provider in psychedelics, I think there can be a focus on, okay, how do we expand this window of tolerance? Meaning, how do we, widen the margins so that you have a little bit of more room to work around in the psychedelic experience, but also in preparation. I think this is really, really important. I think with that, if that is a possibility, then I also think that it will aid and support folks in not only navigating psychedelic experiences, but also like carrying on the momentum of that wider, more flexible and spacious window of tolerance for folks in the integration process and beyond. So I think there's a variety of different reasons why folks have different windows of tolerances. As I mentioned, like trauma, life history, current life events, whether it's a symptomatic, thing. And also, I think that the way that your window of tolerance, like when you are beyond either of those thresholds, the way it shows up for an individual can be extremely different. So I think that this is valuable in looking at the framework of psychedelic experiences, and then it leads to a lot of questions, which by the way I don't have answers to. But how do you increase that sense of safety in order to create a more beneficial window of tolerance for individuals? So when I think about safety, I'm going to talk through a couple of different realms of safety that I think might be helpful in discussing. The first obviously is the most straightforward, which is physical safety. When you're preparing for a psychedelic experience, you hear a lot about set and setting, set being mindset, setting being physical setting. But I also think that physical safety is a lot more than just like making sure you have a good pathway to the bathroom or making sure you have options of laying down or sitting up or moving about your space, thinking about the physical container, of your space. Like if you're working indoors, you might be like, this is the room that I am in and of which I am working in. And then obviously, getting support from a facilitator or a service provider is of course talking through physical safety plans, talking through different things like what happens if nausea comes up? What happens if, I end up getting nausea and I vomit? What should my hydration, look like and be like, leading into a psychedelic experience? So a really, I think, well-versed facilitator will be able to, walk you through this. And again, this is more of that, like, of course, part of this topic that I think is, generally more straightforward to understand, but certainly still nuanced. And then we move into something else, which is that set part, that mental and cognitive, safety. And this is, particularly, I think, more of a challenge for psychedelic journeyers who are prone to like rumination, either ruminating about things in the past, ruminating about things in the future. I think that there's an interesting intersection with like fear, safety, and a sense of control. So I always, not always, but I notice that those types of factors interplay, with each other. You can be completely safe in the moment, meaning like as I'm sitting here recording this podcast for the listeners, I know I'm in my space. I know that my physical needs are met and taken care of, but still mentally and cognitively, based on my history, based on my life, I could feel extremely unsafe right now. I think about abuse survivors in a lot of different formats. There is this sense of like hypervigilance sometimes, which relates to that hyper arousal state and the window of tolerance. And this is actually pretty interesting because a lot of folks who move into psychedelic experiences are like, I want to relieve my trauma, or I want to relieve this stress symptom, or I'm having this, anxiety and whatnot. And I always share with folks that though those are really important things to progressively work on in a really healthy way, I always share folks to like look at those things upon a spectrum, because a lot of those mechanisms are sometimes beneficial as far as, we are humans who are designed to identify threats and sustain our life regardless of how much, suffering there may or may not be, as a part of that. And so I don't think it's as easy as a 1 or 0 to say like, I want to fully relieve my anxiety, or I want to fully relieve my fear, or I want to fully relieve my, worry about this thing, because sometimes those things can really serve us as far as indicating to our body that there is a stressor or a trigger or something of which our body is going into that defense mode, hyper arousal or hypo arousal, in this, concept of this, window of tolerance. And so I share with folks that all of these things, which this will also lead into my next, piece of safety, which is like emotional safety. But I share with folks that there's a potential that all of those things can be teachers to us. I take that with a real big compassion in my heart for those who are deeply, deeply suffering, from anxiety, from depressive symptoms, from, traumatic responses. I have a lot of heart for folks. But what I'm speaking to here is that there are many folks who look at their life, whether they're over traumatized or whether they're in a hyper arousal state or in a hypo arousal state, and they look at themselves and they're like, something's broken with me, something's wrong with me, which then can create a real sense of unsafety. And so one of the paradigms that I work with clients is that I believe that you're not broken. I believe that your system has been the way that it's been to help you survive the stuff that you've survived in your life. Now that you're not in that survival necessity, but you're still in that survival state, I can see how that's created a lot of suffering in your life. And so, I can share that in my personal life, like my ability to sense people's emotions, the ability to read a room, the ability to get a sense of if I'm emotionally safe or not, a lot of that comes from my traumatic childhood and my upbringing and my parents. If I regarded that as all bad, then I wouldn't be able to use those skills to have more empathy for my friends and the people in my life and the clients that I work with, to have more emotional intelligence. So you can see how, like, they always say, like, oftentimes a person's trauma or difficult life circumstances end up being like their superpowers. I just want to provide that, contextual, lens here. So, to encompass this thought is that, the mind is very powerful and it can convince you in and out of anything. And even if you're feeling generally in an environment of safety, your mind can really create a narrative that's, different than that. And so just being aware of that, I think, is really important for folks who are going through, preparation processes and psychedelic experiences, which then leads to the next part, which I mentioned before, which is this concept of like emotional safety. And I think that, emotional safety takes on a little bit of a different lens for me, because there's a lot of, societal norms and social conditioning on what types of emotions and feelings are allowed given your circumstance, given your identity, given your intersectionality, all of that. For example, if I was a male and I am a male identifying, and I walked into, a work environment and I was like bawling crying. Let's say I worked in like a corporate job or something. I think there would be a lot of folks who would look at me and be like, what's wrong? What's going on? That's inappropriate. This isn't the place for that. This isn't the. But then what if I came in and I said, oh, I just had a loved one pass away? Then it's totally acceptable for me to be bawling and crying and all of that. And so, when I think about emotional safety, I think a lot about, is there a welcome and inviting space for you to feel any and all of your emotions, and for you to be validated in that and be allowed, meaning you give yourself permission to feel that way in that moment, especially during a psychedelic experience. I think that a really, really well-versed facilitator will create that safe space for you. But I think what's more important is that the facilitator or the service provider can only do so much. They can only do so much in creating that safe container for you. But then it's actually you who has to give yourself the permission and the allowance and the okayness for you to feel whatever it is that you feel in that moment. I also think that this is an interesting conversation because we cast a lot of judgment on the emotions and things that we feel. Like, there's almost in my own self, there's like a hierarchical order of what are good emotions and good feelings to have, all the way down to the things that I am not allowed to have. For example, good emotions might be like connected with everybody, and, feeling a lot of love and feeling a lot of joy and feeling a lot of, ecstasy. Okay. And then you move down into feelings of blame, shame, guilt, those like really, really hard ones. And those ones are lower on the totem pole. Those are the ones that we generally like to avoid. I'll share with you that one of the things in psychedelic work is, how do we actually shine a light on all of these things? Because all of these different emotions and feelings can be doorways upon which we can use psychedelic experience to navigate and move through whatever that is. I'll tell you from direct firsthand experience that experiencing a lot of shame, or revisiting a lot of childhood shame, revisiting a lot of shame of actions that I've done and things in my life, caused me to then work on those things more directly, caused me to go seek, therapy and more psychedelic experiences that are oriented to that, and community around me who I can like express and share my shame. What a radical idea, you know? And so in that way, experiencing shame in that moment allowed me to then process through it. I wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't have a sense of safety and a sense of normalization to say it's okay for me to feel and navigate through this. So don't be so quick, I think, to label these different emotions and things as either good, bad, or this serves me and this one doesn't. As long as you can cultivate a real deep and strong sense of safety, I think it gives you the resilience to navigate whatever it is emotionally that comes up in the psychedelic experience. And then this relates to safety in the body. That's kind of my, last piece here, is that safety in the body, it's kind of its own other category. Now, I want to be cautious to like not put these into buckets and silos because they all are extremely, interrelated. But the nervous system in your body, it's a pattern machine. So even if you work on, okay, I have a physical safety plan, even if you do have a great mental framework on how to navigate rumination, fear, control, anxiety, even if you give yourself that permission to be emotionally safe to work through whatever comes up, your body can still be having a nervous system breakdown, deregulation, hyperarousal, hypoarousal. And I think this is just important to note because, we've chatted in episodes in the past about Dr. Peter Levine's work in somatic work, in somatic release, in psychedelic experiences, somatic release in nature as, just like human mechanisms. And I find that the body is the one that you really can't fool. I think that you can create narratives around all of the other, three aspects, but your body's having the response that it's generally having, whether you are starting to feel a sense of heightened safety, or I think what's more pertinent here is when it's difficult for you to come into a seat of grounded safety in the preparation process. So there's a lot of folks who are maybe changing their medications or have a specific life circumstance or something that makes it really, really hard for them to be in that seat of safety. And it for sure shows up in the body. So this is getting into work that's like way beyond my expertise, for sure. But I want to just highlight to folks that there is a parallel process in the body and the nervous system. And one of the goals I think in psychedelic work is like, how do we get all of these things aligned and like working together? Because what I often find is that these different aspects, physical safety, emotional, mental, cognitive, and safety in the body, they're usually disconnected and kind of running their own different programs. So when I talk about, nervous system regulation and coming into a seat of safety prior to a psychedelic experience, I'm also thinking about like, okay, how do we get all of these things to be, at least working in some type of a unison? Easier said than done, very, very different per the individual. So, I've talked through a couple of those different elements of safety, and I've talked a little bit about how this shows up in psychedelic experiences. I'll also have worthy to note is that not everybody feels unsafe when they're in a psychedelic experience. I've seen this interesting dynamic with folks where, let's say they have a general sense of unsafety in their life. They move through the psychedelic experience, and let's say they're feeling feelings of, connectedness, or that, all is okay, or that they're on the right path, they're doing the right things, or feeling that what I call like sometimes what people experience is like this cosmic relief or psychedelic relief of whatever's going on in their life, or some connecting the dots, or some releasing of trauma, or I've had clients who cried for the first time, in many, many decades. So just feeling a safe place for them in order to do that. And then when they get into the integration process, they lose that feeling. They lose that feeling of like safety and connectedness and okayness that might come from a psychedelic experience. So I guess what I'm saying here is that it can cut a lot of different ways. And the way that safety or unsafety shows up in psychedelic experiences can really vary by the person. But I always know that folks who move into the integration process, there's usually this fear of like, oh my goodness, am I regressing? Or am I doing this right? Or am I like backtracking? Did it work? Is it not working? So this is where I take the emphasis off of the psychedelic experience and I put it into integration, because integration is also an exercise in how to expand your window of tolerance, how to know when you're in hyper arousal or hypo arousal states, how to, get back into a calm, grounded sense, how to regulate, your nervous system. So that's just to share that it's much more than the 4 to 6 hours of the altered state of consciousness that you might, find yourself in. So I'm sure there's a lot of folks who are listening to this like, yeah, that's all great, theoretical. I hear this. That makes sense to a degree. And then you're like, but where's the tangible part of this? What can you do? And I think that, of course, I don't know everybody in the audience, so I can't really give like directed advice on like, hey, here's what might work for you. But I can share a little bit about some concepts that have been helpful, to my clients in the past. The namely, I think, is reframing the preparation process. I think the preparation process has a lot of different components to it. Obviously, like logistics, building a plan, clarifying intentions, mindful exercise. Like there's just a lot of different components to preparation. But one thing that's often overlooked is this thing that I see that happens with every client is that when they're committed to a psychedelic experience and they're moving into and preparing for it, a lot of their stuff just starts coming up like naturally in their life, whether it's a pain point, a trigger point, an issue with somebody in your life, your own symptomatic issues. Like for me, it's always like self-doubt, self-worth, like not worthy of love type stuff always comes up. It's almost like this pressure cooker that starts to build up and build up. It's so that it can, in my opinion, so that it can rise closer to the surface in order for us to work on these things, in order for us to better access them, in order for us to better bring that into the medicine space. And so each time those things come up, I think that it presents an opportunity to what I call or share with my clients is to like do a practice round or to get a rep in there. Let's say you are feeling a heightened sense of anxiety or overwhelm leading into a psychedelic experience, hyper arousal because you move beyond your threshold of your window of tolerance. That can actually create an opportunity for you to practice in real time. Okay, how do I get myself back regulated? How do I get myself back into a grounded spot? How do I get myself back into the seat of the witness, the seat of the observer? Is it breathing technique? Is it moving my body physically? Is it a mantra? Is it affirmations? Is it a reminder? What do I need to do to get my body into a calm state? And so, with folks who are, I think, a little bit newer to this, I share, wow, what a great opportunity that is to be able to go through that in the 2 to 4 to 6 weeks of preparation that some folks, need to be able to navigate, because the more practice rounds you get in preparation on feeling dysregulated, feeling, unsafe, and then the more you're able to then allow yourself to go into a process of like, okay, how do I return to safety? Likely the way better you're going to be able to do that in the psychedelic experience. And I don't want to overcomplicate it. I think a lot of this is trust. A lot of this is returning to your body, returning to your breath, returning to your seat of witness, your seat of observation. And then in a really strange way, like release that grip of control in dictating how or what should happen in the psychedelic experience, because that dissonance can create a lot of challenge. Now, that's not the case for everybody. I know that. I'm speaking very specifically to, what I've seen, in my own client work. But I think if there's this reframe in the preparation process around, oh, actually, this thing that's coming up, it's not something that I need to stifle or something that I need to fix. This process is coming up for a reason, which gives me an opportunity to come back into a seat of safety. So safety is kind of built. It's not something that all of a sudden you're like in, that state. And I think that it's built across, a lot of different realms within yourself. And I hope that this conversation can illuminate or name or highlight some things that might be helpful for you as you're cultivating, a sense of safety as you're moving through a psychedelic experience. So that wraps up our episode for today. Thank you so much for listening and tuning in. Before we end the episode, I'd like to just really thank our community again and read a little, testimonial that came through with one of our folks who worked with a facilitator within our network. So this individual said, "My facilitator was a wonderful guide. I felt comfortable with him right away. I really appreciated his ability to know when to step back and when to check if everything was okay. He also knew about dosage and suggested where to start and ramped me up when needed. I felt he was instrumental in my having a positive experience from the first intake to the follow-up." So just thank you so much for that. Thank you for the trust. Thank you to, that facilitator who's doing that good work. And thanks for letting me share that testimonial. You can get our podcast anywhere that you get podcasts, Apple, Spotify. But those are, the two main channels. We look forward to connecting with you all again on our next episode. Thanks.